Okay, this is for a philosopher, a quick review of Kantian ethics, and it's geared towards intro level. All right, so if you're more advanced, you're going to use more technical, more specific terminology. You might approach this a little bit differently, but what I want to do here is really dive into Kantian ethics and sort of ask ourselves, what is it like to be Kant? How does he see the world? How is he approaching things? Let's try to make sense of how he operates. So, with that there in place, let us first do a quick review of some of the main points. I'm not going to go too deep into these. I just want to sort of list out main points to Kantian ethics. So first, Kantian ethics is deontology, and deontology is an act-based ethics. So when we start to analyze the ethics of something, we start with what is the action? Is the action sort of morally right or morally wrong? So doing the right thing, right action, is primary. And when we figure out what we should do, we are following the moral law. Right? So Kant is, as a deontology, you follow the rules. So what makes something a law? Right? Key here is that for something to be a law, there can be no exceptions. If there are exceptions, then it's not a law. It's a advisement. It is a suggestion, but it's not a law. If a law, then it treats everybody equally. No one gets to get around it. Now, what makes these specific laws moral? Right? And that moral part is sort of different than a law which might be natural laws, like the law of gravity. In law of gravity, you don't get to decide whether or not you're going to follow it. But in a moral law, which governs sort of behavior, human behavior here, you choose whether or not to follow it or not. So there's nothing that compels you to follow it. You have to decide, I am going to follow these rules. So there's no exceptions, but you get to choose whether or not you're going to abide by these laws of behavior. Okay, so Kant's name for the moral law is the categorical imperative. All right, moving forward. Another really important aspect of Kantian ethics is the will, right? Remember before I said that in moral laws, you have to decide whether or not to follow that law. So you're exercising your will. You're deciding what you're going to do. And the part of you that makes those sorts of decisions, that exerts yourself in the world, is the will. And for Kant, a good will is the purest form of goodness. And why is that? Because the will is your intentions, right? Intentions don't change regardless of what happens, right? Whatever the consequence is, even if you're unsuccessful in making the action you intended to do, that doesn't change the fact that you had certain intentions that you were acting upon. So once you have a good will, whatever happens in the world, it won't affect that. So it's sort of, for Kant, that's really important. And he thinks that you have to be a certain type of creature to be able to exercise a will. And that's someone that is able to have the faculty of reason, because to be able to make choices and be free in making those choices, not be sort of pulled along by, some sort of outside influence or some sort of reward or punishment. You have to be able to reason, come to your own sort of clear-headed perspective on what is before you, and then make a decision whether it's right or wrong, and whether or not you want to do what is right because it is right. So the will is very important. And the will is tied into being free to make your own decisions, and it's only those that are able to exercise reason that can do this sort of thing and can be free and ultimately can be moral, right? You have to be able to exercise reason to be able to exercise your free will to make a moral decision whether or not you will do something because it is right, and that alone. Okay, so intentions matter here, and you do what's right just because it's right. Remember, Kant calls that duty for duty's sake. Okay, so it's really important that this is a deontology and that we don't do anything because of the consequences, right? Because we're trying to be rewarded or escape punishment. That is not a reason to do anything if you're trying to be ethical, if you're trying to do something that has what Kant calls moral worth. And since part of Kant's critique of any sort of consequentialism, any sort of ethics that's based on the consequences, that we really have no control over what the consequences might be, right? There's so many outside factors might get in the way of what you're doing, and you're trying to realize that in many ways it's luck, whatever happens. So for Kant, if you do the right thing because it's the right thing, the only result is that you become worthy of any of life's rewards that you might experience, but it doesn't guarantee that you'll experience any of this goodness, any of this the pleasures of life. It just means that if you happen to, if you're lucky enough to, you'd be worthy of them, and that's the most you could ask for in ethics. It's not going to get you anything being good, but it makes you a worthy person of any of the luxuries of life. All right, so that's our quick review. What I really want to do is get to sort of thinking through how Kant figures out what he's going to do or not do. Before I get there, I just want to point out also that when we talk about the categorical imperative, there's different formulations, ways in which Kant thinks you can interpret the same thing. And we talked about formula of universality, right? That's when you take sort of an action, you turn it into a maxim. This is something that I'll just do all the time like this whenever I come into this situation. And then you universalize it. You say, what if everybody did that? Now, in Mill does the same sort of thing when he sort of makes some corrections or additions to Bentham's ethics. And he says, instead of just looking at the consequences of a single action, right? Mill says, let's look at what if you always did this, that in that situation, the same action, and let's consider if everybody did the same action, and then what would be the consequences? So if it became a rule, what would be the consequences of that rule? That's what Mill does with utilitarianism, and it becomes called rule utilitarianism. Kant doesn't care about consequences. So when he sort of universalizes the maxim, he doesn't care about consequences. What he cares about is, does it still make sense, right? Kant is very rational. Before, when I said, what is it like to be Kant? The thing I think of that probably none of you have ever heard of is there's this science fiction character named Spock. It's from Star Trek. And I'm sure you've never heard of Spock, but he's an alien. But he's not entirely an alien. He's actually part human and part Vulcan. Now, the Vulcan side experiences no emotions. They're completely rational. And it's really interesting, but it also can be really frustrating to others to meet a creature that doesn't show any emotion, but they're just purely rational. But Spock is part human. He's able to suppress the human part most of the time, but sometimes he does experience emotions. And this, I think, is exactly what it would be like to be Kant. That for the most part, he tries to be as rational as possible about everything. But he does also experience emotions from time to time. And That's how we're going to sort of approach Kant when he does his ethics. So the formula of universality is Kant being super rational, right? He turns an action into a maxim, he universalizes it, and then he sees, does it cause any logical contradictions? Or he also will consider whether there are any practical contradictions. Does something become impossible when we do that? And that is the basis of his ethics, right? It's based in reason. And it's very interesting to compare this to something like divine command theory, which the name is even close to categorical imperative, because the word imperative and command basically are the same word. And so the real difference is categorical, which is what Kant has for his Kantian ethics, and then divine. And in divine command theory, the rules, the commands, the imperatives come from some divine entity. But for Kant, the rules, the imperative, comes from the categories or reason itself. And I think Kant thought this would actually give us a more universal ethics, right? Everybody has different religions, and even if you have the same religion, it's broken up into, different groups, each group has slightly different beliefs. And so it's hard to have a universal ethics that's based on religion when we have such all this diversity of religious beliefs and practices, and sometimes it contradicts. But it seems to Kant that reason is something that's universal, right? It doesn't matter what culture you come from, it doesn't matter what religion you come from. Everybody kind of uses the same logic. And so if you can base an ethics on reason alone, then maybe everybody can kind of work together, discuss it together, and figure out what's right together, regardless of where we're coming from. Okay, so the formula of universality, takes a single action and figures out whether or not it violates the categorical imperative by looking for contradictions when we go through that process of making it a maxim and then universalizing the maxim. Then we have the formula of humanity, which is really about how we perceive other people, and that we don't just perceive them as something, as an instrument, as something to be used to get some sort of consequence, as just a means to an end, right? That's a very consequentialist way of looking at something. Instead, we have to recognize that human beings are an ends in themselves, right? That there's a value to them just in being who they are, as rational creatures that have a will, that can have a good will, gives them value. And we can't forget that. We can't just use another person as a means to some sort of end. And formula of autonomy is close to that, but what that formulation recognizes is the importance of that freedom, that autonomy to make your own decision, to decide for yourself and to reason for yourself about what is right, what is the nature of an action, and then whether or not it violates, and then to exercise that will, to have a good will. Okay, there's a lot more to say about this. I'm just trying to rush through it to get to the next slide, which now I have a bunch of examples. We can kind of think through how Kant sees things. So let's start with lying to people, right? We often feel like, oh man, I think the right thing to do here is to lie. Maybe making a lie might protect somebody, or it might protect you from some being uncomfortable or embarrassed about something, and so you lie. And so Kant wants to know, is lying wrong? Because if it's wrong, if it violates the moral law, the categorical imperative, then there's no exceptions, right? We should just never lie. So what do? We have to first turn it into a maxim. Whenever, it seems like life will be easier for me. I lie. And then we universalize it. What if everybody did that? So are there any logical problems here? So to do that, this is the real hard part, I think, of being Kant, is you have to figure out what the nature then of lying is. You have to really think about and discuss and figure out, what is the nature of lying? What are you doing? Right? If we don't know that, then we can't figure out if there's problems. And for Kant, when he thinks about lying, he says, well, you're telling somebody something that's not true, but they believe it is true. That's how a lie works, right? I'm pretending it's true, but it's false, and the other side believes that it's true. But if everybody does that all the time, right, then nobody would ever expect that the other person is telling something that is true, right? But that's fundamental for lying, is that the other side does think it's true. So it becomes impossible to lie if everybody's lying. And so for Kant, that's a logical problem, and it means that lying violates the categorical imperative. We can't do it. Right? It's not based on it's going to hurt somebody. It's not based on any sort of consequence. It's just the fact that when we universalize the maxim, it doesn't make sense anymore. All right, what about murder? Killing somebody, right? Probably most people at some point, have entertained the thought, oh man, I just want to kill that person. Probably didn't mean it that seriously, hopefully not, but I think it's pretty natural that someone might feel that. Now, those are emotions that are driving that, right? And Kant is trying to do things rational, so he's going to try to tone down that emotional reaction where you might feel really violent and mad, and he wants to be rational. He wants to think about, what are you doing here? What's that nature of that sort of action of killing someone? And then if you universalize the maxim, does it still make sense, or is there some sort of logical paradox here? So what is the nature of killing someone? Well, you have a problem with somebody, and to solve that problem, you kill them. What if I did that every time I had a problem with somebody? I killed them. And what if everybody did that? Well, there's lots of ways that we can approach this, but one way is that if you have a problem with somebody, right, that person exists. But if you kill them, then they no longer exist. But how could somebody both exist and not exist? We have a problem there, a logical problem, a contradiction. So killing someone violates the categorical imperative when Kant thinks about it. And so he's going to say, I can never kill somebody to try to solve a problem. That violates the categorical imperative, and there's no exceptions. Okay. What about stealing something? Maybe you were somebody that shoplifted when you were younger. Now you look back and you say, I did do it, but I don't feel great about it anymore. But was it really wrong to take something? Well, Kant's going to think about it, right? He's going to reason. He's thinking about what the definition of stealing is. And stealing, you might define it as taking somebody else's property. And you might think about, okay, what is property? Well, property is, you might define it as something that you have control over, right? An item that you control. Well, what if every time I wanted something, I just took it? Right? Stealing. You just take something that you want that somebody else has. And what if we just did that all the time? What if everybody did that all the time? Right? If you wanted something, just take it. Well, that would mean that anytime you saw something, you took it, which would mean that nobody would ever really have any control over anything. But to steal something, it has to be somebody else's property, but it's impossible for anybody to have property if they never have any control over any items. So stealing also doesn't make sense when we think of it in this this fashion where we think of it in terms of everybody always does it all the time. So stealing is going to violate the categorical imperative, and Kant's going to say, okay, I shouldn't steal. And he doesn't not steal because, it's going to make somebody feel bad or it's going to harm them. He doesn't care about the consequences of stealing. He's just thinking about in terms of reason, definitions. It's a strange ethics, right? Because it has nothing to do with how you might hurt somebody or make them feel. And we usually often think about like, oh man, I hate to have things taken from me. I hate to have someone steal something from me. And we base it being wrong on the consequences. But here, Kant doesn't care about the consequences. It's a deontology, and he's just considering the nature of the action and whether it still makes sense, it's still reasonable if that's what everybody did all the time. Okay, what about saving a life? Right, now this is a little bit different because so far what I've looked at are things that we shouldn't do. Right? Saving a life seems like it might be something that we should do, but how would Kant figure that out? Well, it's the same way, except would it violate the categorical imperative if we didn't save a life? Right? So if we had an opportunity to save someone's life and we don't do that, does that violate? Because if that's a violation, not doing it, then we get an obligation to do it. So we have to sort of get that through our heads. All right, it's a little bit difficult, right? This is reasoning. This is not an easy ethics because we have to sort of get deep into abstract thought. Now we're looking at a negative. What if I never save a life every time I have an opportunity and the ability to save somebody's life? And it's going to actually be a lot like the idea of killing someone or murdering someone. If someone then dies, how can I talk about saving their life if there is no life? Right? That doesn't make sense. So, if it violates the categorical imperative not to save somebody's life when you can, right, when you are able to do it, then you have an obligation. Every time there's someone who might lose their life and you could save it, you have an obligation to save that person's life without exception. So there's sort of a positive law, an obligation of something you must do. What about if somebody's hungry, right? Do we have an obligation to give them a hot meal? And here, what if whenever we came by someone who was not hungry, who was hungry, and if we never gave them a hot meal, and we always did that, would that create any sort of contradiction or paradox or something like that? And I don't think it would, right? If I never gave out hot meals to people who are hungry, there's nothing there that would challenge the logic of what I'm doing, the definition of what I'm doing. So it doesn't seem like we have an obligation to give anybody who's hungry a hot meal, though we do have an obligation to save someone's life if they're about to die, and we have the ability to save their life. What we find with deontology is it gives us sort of the baseline of the things you absolutely cannot do or have to do. But giving someone a hot meal is a nice thing to do, but you're not obligated to do it. Okay, so what about suicide, right? You should probably already start to see that anytime someone's life is in jeopardy, Kant's going to have a problem. There's going to be a paradox because you're dealing with a person and then no person. After death, there's no person there. So that's going to cause a problem. But also, we can look at the other formulations, and often it's easier to use a different formulation. So suicide, you, in a way, are using your life as a means to get rid of some pain and suffering, usually. And that's just to use yourself as just a means to an end. And that's going to violate the formula of humanity. Okay, let's see. There's, so if it violates the categorical imperative to take your life, then you have an obligation to keep yourself alive, right? That'd be the flip side. But there's a really interesting thing that Kant talks about, because it's not just about being alive. It's you need to be able to reason, right? You need to be able to reason in order to figure out what's the nature of an action is and whether or not it violates the categorical imperative if we do it or don't do it. And to be able to reason takes a certain state or disposition. If you're just surviving, but you're starving because you haven't had that hot meal, right? Then it's going to be really hard to be able to reason. So Kant actually makes an argument that you need to ensure a certain level, minimum level of well-being, so that you're in a state where you can use these higher functions like being able to reason and being able to exercise your will in a free way. So that's actually something I think is pretty interesting that you get in Kant, is that you do need to have some self-care. It's minimal. It's just enough so that you're able to use your ability to reason and your free will, but it's something, right? It's something. So, okay. Let's just move on. And the last thing I was just going to talk about are just a few issues that are still on the table when it comes to Kantian deontology. Number one is intentions matter. Why you do something matters. Are you doing it just because it's the right thing to do, or are you seeking some sort of end, and that's why you're doing it? You're acting by inclination. And the problem is we never really know what truly a person's intentions are, right? They can tell us, but they could be lying. And sometimes someone might try to be honest and say what their intentions are, and they might actually not know their own true intentions. They might later on figure out, you know what, I didn't do it because of that. I was just telling myself that. I was trying to believe it, but actually this is why I did it, and now I realize. So even you might not even know your own intentions. One of the things Kant talks about is that if you do an action that causes you pain and suffering, then obviously you didn't do it to, get any sort of reward. So that seems like an instance where you did it just because it's the right thing to do and not for any sort of consequence. And so those are instances where you make sort of a self-sacrifice. But we also know that doing something because it's the right thing to do makes you worthy. And so you do get something in a way. It's not something that is tangible, right? And because it's not like you're actually going to, just being worthy of any happiness you might experience doesn't mean you're going to experience that happiness, but it is something. So it's just very difficult with Kant to figure out and really be sure what the real reasons are why somebody does something. Another issue on the table is, Kant's not thinking about consequences, but what if the consequences are catastrophic? Should we really be blind to consequences if, the world is at stake? Doesn't that seem like to be ethical at that point? You should really think about the consequences. So that's a problem for maybe for deontology, and some people will put limits on deontology and say, well, once the consequences get beyond a certain level, then we should in fact think about the consequences when we're trying to think about what the right thing to do is. Another issue on the table is the spirit versus the letter of the law. Talk to any lawyer, and you look at what the law is, or the moral law in this case, and you can find a loophole, you can find a way around it, you can redescribe what you're doing in a way that it doesn't violate that law, right? No, I wasn't stealing anything, I was borrowing it, and I intend to return it. I just don't know when I'm going to return it. It might be a while, and eventually I'll figure it out, because I do have the intentions of returning this item that I took without asking. But I will also let the person know I took it at some point, either when I return it or before that point, and I do intend to do that. So you can sort of talk your way around the letter of the law and still be violating the spirit of the law. So it's tricky. It's all very tricky. And finally, there's a problem in Kantian ethics when sort of two obligations collide, right? We don't really have a good reason to choose one over the other, because none of them have exceptions. So when we do have obligations that collide or that conflict, it's very hard to know what to do. Okay. The last thing I'll say is that there's a lot of creativity for something that's so rational. There's actually a lot of creativity that goes into making sure that you do follow the categorical imperative. So if there's the rule that you can never lie, right, and perhaps telling the truth in a certain situation might cause some catastrophic consequences, you can get creative and not lie, but figure out how to address the situation in a way that doesn't violate the law and doesn't cause that catastrophic consequence, right? So you might think, okay, someone asked me a question, I'm not going to lie, but maybe I don't have to answer the question. Or maybe I'll tell them that I don't want to answer that question. So I haven't lied, and I've sort of dealt with having to potentially have to lie if I had answered the question the way it was asked. So you can be really creative in trying to figure out how to always sort of not violate the categorical imperatives and still not cause sort of some catastrophic consequence. Okay, so that is enough on Kant, and we'll keep thinking about how to be ethical. And sometimes when we want to be ethical, we can be like Kant. We can get really rational about it. We can think about, what is the definition of this action? What if myself and everybody else always did it? Would it still be reasonable? And sort of make decisions based just on that. And other times we can use some of the other theories we've been learning about. All right, I will see everybody later.